As we look at the skin and membranes, we'll be looking at our first organs. The integument, or the skin, is composed of two layers. The epidermis, which is a stratified squamous epithelial layer, and the dermis, which is a dense irregular connective tissue, make this an organ. Two tissues working together are an organ. The integumentary system also has some additional structures known as the skin appendages. This would be the hair and nails, the glands, both the sebaceous glands, which are the oil glands, and the sudoriferous glands, which are the sweat glands, and a muscle known as the erector pili muscle. The epidermis is made of stratified squamous epithelial cells. Here you see the several layers that make it stratified and the flattened irregular cells that make it squamous. The entire skin section shows the epidermis and the dermis. And here we also see the hypodermis. Now you may recognize the hypodermis as being adipose tissue. The hypodermis is not part of the skin, but it does help attach the skin to underlying structures and provides for some insulation. Embedded in the dermis are many of the skin appendages. This is a hair follicle. The epidermis has 5 layers. Going from the deepest layer out, we start with the stratum basale. This is the layer that is actively undergoing mitosis and constantly making new keratinocytes. This is the layer closest to the dermis. Epithelial tissue does not have its own blood supply and must rely on diffusion of nutrients from some blood-rich area, in this case the dermis. So the stratum basale is in a good position to receive nutrients from the dermis. The stratum spinosum is the next layer. We call this the pre-keratin forming layer. Keratin is going to be the protein that will eventually waterproof the cells. These cells are just beginning to develop keratin. The stratum granulosum is when the cells are pretty full of keratin granules. They're becoming waterproofed. They're also dying. First of all, they're further away from their food supply, so they get less nutrition, and that waterproofing means that it's hard for material to get into these cells. The stratum lucidum is only seen in a few areas of the body. It's in thick-skinned areas only, like the palms of the hand and the soles of the feet. These are simply dead cells. The stratum corneum is the many layers of stratified epithelium, and all of these cells are dead. They slough off very easily. This adds to one of the protective features of the skin. As we rub up against things, rather than abrading the skin heavily, we simply leave a few skin cells behind. Here is another picture of the skin. You can see the stratum corneum, which is very thick. This has a stratum lucidum, a very thin layer of cells, the stratum granulosum, the stratum spinosum, and the stratum basale, which is really only a single layer of actively dividing cells. The dermis has 2 layers. The first layer is the papillary layer. This is a very thin upper layer of dermis that has finger-like projections. These are what create fingerprints. The reticular layer makes up most of the dermis. 80% of the dermis is the reticular layer. This is where all of the appendages come from. This layer is that dense, irregular connective tissue. Gives us a lot of strength and a lot of give. So here, again, we see the epidermis. Here is the papillary layer of the dermis with those projections. And as the epidermis follows that, we get fingerprints. And then here is the reticular layer. These are some of the glands that are found in the reticular layer. And here's a blood vessel. Here's a sensory organ. Again, showing all the layers. The stratum corneum is very thick. The rest of the layers of the epidermis, the papillary region, and the reticular region. And then here is that hypodermis area. One of the skin appendages is the sebaceous glands, or the oil glands. Cells in these glands secrete sebum, or oil, that act as a lubricant. You'll remember that those skin cells are pretty dead. This helps keep them pliable. Oil glands are found all over the skin except the palms of the hand and the soles of the feet. Typically, the duct empties into a hair follicle, so the oil comes out along the hair follicle, making it pliable, and then spreads out on the surface of the skin near the hair follicle. This is a hair follicle right here, and here is the oil gland. These are epithelial cells that manufacture sebum and then dump that sebum into a duct which empties into the hair follicle. The sudoriferous or sweat glands have cells that secrete a watery fluid that contains waste products. Most of our sweat is like 99% water, so there's not a lot of waste products in it. We do have 2 kinds of sweat glands. The eccrine sweat glands are distributed all over the body, and they function in thermoregulation. They're the ones that make the watery sweat, and whenever you get too hot, you sweat, and evaporating the sweat cools you down. The apocrine sweat glands are found only in the axillary and genital regions of the body. They do not become active until puberty, and they secrete a sweat that has water in it, but it also has this lipid-based material in it. Bacteria can eat this lipid-based material and make byproducts which don't smell so good. So these are the sweat glands that are responsible for body odor. Apocrine sweat glands are stimulated by stress. Now this is an eccrine sweat gland. Notice the coils here in the dermis and the duct that comes up and empties onto the surface of the skin. This is a cross-section through that ductwork, and here you see simple cuboidal epithelial tissue. This is very common in glands like this. The hair follicle is composed of a root and a shaft. Hair is found distributed over the body except in the palms of the hands, the soles of the feet, around the nipples, on the lips, and parts of the external genitalia. Attached to the hair follicle is a smooth muscle known as the erector pili muscle. This is attached to the base of the hair follicle and the papillary layer of the dermis. When this contracts, it pulls the hair follicle up against the skin and gives you goosebumps. The contraction of the erector pili muscle generates a little heat, so a lot of times you get goosebumps when you're cold. This shows sort of the whole setup. We have the hair follicle down into the dermis. Here's the root. Here would be the actively dividing part of the hair. And just like with the skin, as these cells get further and further out, they die and become keratinized. Here is an oil gland emptying into the hair shaft. And here is an erector pili muscle. When this shortens, it will pull this up against the skin and make the skin protrude outward. Burns are one of the things that damage our skin. Superficial burns or first-degree burns damage only the epidermis. The skin is red. Partial thickness burns or second-degree burns damage the epidermis and the upper part of the dermis. The epidermis and dermis will separate and fluid will collect between them, so you'll see blisters. Full thickness or third-degree burns damage the epidermis and all of the dermis. These burns are not particularly painful because all of the pain receptors have been destroyed. So superficial, first degree, partial thickness, second degree, full thickness, third degree. Body membranes are simple organs. They have two tissue layers. Epithelial membranes are an epithelial sheet bound to an underlying layer of connective tissue. And we have three different epithelial membranes. The cutaneous membrane we've just talked about, it's the skin. The mucous membranes secrete mucus, and the serous membranes secrete serous fluid. The skin or cutaneous membrane is exposed to air, so it's considered a dry membrane. And we know that this is stratified squamous epithelium over a dense irregular connective tissue. The mucous membranes or mucosa are called wet membranes. These membranes line cavities that have a natural opening to the outside of the body. So the digestive tract, the respiratory tract, the urinary tract, and the reproductive tract would all be lined with mucous membranes. So here you see mucous membranes in the lungs, in the digestive tract. The serous membranes or serosa secrete fluid that acts to lubricate and nourish the membrane. Serous membranes are found lining closed body cavities with no natural opening to the outside. Not only does it line the cavity, but it covers the organs of that body cavity. That's because the serous membrane folds in on itself, and we have essentially two layers. The parietal layer will be what's lining the body cavity. And then as it folds back to cover the organs, we'll have the visceral layer covering the organs. In this space, we'll have some fluid produced. This will be serous fluid. This is the pericardium, so you can see how this sac surrounding the heart is going to have a parietal pericardium and a visceral pericardium that will cover the heart. The serous membranes are the pericardium, which surrounds the heart, the pleura, which lines the thoracic cavity and covers the lungs, and the peritoneum, which lines the abdominal cavity and covers the digestive organs. So here is the parietal and visceral peritoneum. Here is the parietal and visceral pleura and the parietal and visceral pericardium.